Hi everyone. So in this video, I just want to talk a little bit about part 3 of your planner, which is coming due. We don't have class on Friday because we never do, but you also are not going to school on Thursday. So Thursday and Friday, the college will be closed. So hopefully that'll give you a bit of a break. So pretty much the whole week I'm going to sum up here. If you look at part 3 in the language section, what you're going to see is 4 questions about language. And I actually don't think that there's a very good source about this writing technique question. I don't think that it's a helpful question, so I'm actually just going to tell you to get rid of it. So just 3 questions. All you have to do before Thursday for 101 is answer these 3 questions. Now, that doesn't mean that they're easy. These questions are a little bit tricky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about them. So the first question asks about connotative language, and so does the second question. So what the heck is connotative language? Well, you actually have a very handy source on that here in the content section. So I'm going to show you, and I'll link these in the announcement. I'm going to show you 2 learning materials that are going to help you. One is on tone and one is on denotation versus connotation. So we can start with denotation versus connotation one. So denotation is the dictionary definition of a word. Connotation is all of the implications and associations that are tied up in that word. So one of the classic examples is if you say the word home, if you look up the definition for home, it's going to be place where you live. So we're doing denotation. Oh, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking up home. We'll say home definition. Home. The place where one lives permanently, especially as a member of a family or household. So that's a pretty dry dictionary definition. If I tell you to picture home in your mind, you're going to have different associations with that. And some of you might think of people, some of you might think of structures, some of you might have positive feelings, and some of you might have negative feelings. That's because there's a lot more associated with the word home, and it brings up a lot more than what is shown here. I talked about it in my other class this morning, and it's a pretty good analogy. If you think about emojis and what emojis mean, if you send a picture, a literal emoji, it is a picture of a certain thing. If you send somebody the peach emoji, it is a picture of a peach, but that's not the connotation that it brings up when you use the emoji now. So you understand the idea of connotation, of how something can be both one thing, a representation of one thing, but also include a lot of other meaning. So when we talk about something like home, the dictionary definition is the denotation, the place where one lives permanently, especially as a member of a family or a household. The connotation is all of the feelings that it brings up with it. So when you are going through and looking at, let me just pull up this one, looking at these questions, it's asking you, what connotative language does the author use? Is it positive, negative, or neutral? And I think that's actually not a great question because connotative language can't be neutral. Connotative, the whole point of connotative, so we're just going to say, is it positive or negative? Because the whole point of connotative language is it brings up these other associations. So are you looking at positive or negative in the article? And one thing you want to ask yourself to figure out if something is connotative is, could another neutral or opposite word be used instead? So one of the fastest ways to figure it out, I think, is to go through the article and look for examples. Often when we're looking for examples that have a connotation, we're looking for emotive words. So I think I mentioned this last time, but I will mention it again. If you go into our classroom, I also linked a copy of the PDF. So if you can't get back into this website and you didn't feel like signing up for it, you can sign up to be part of Inside Higher Ed. It's a free sign up. You just need to use your Dell Tech address. But if you don't want to do that, you can pull up this PDF document that's linked here. And what I would recommend doing is downloading it or even just copy and pasting it into a Word document and going through and looking for the words that have that have an emotion associated with them. So for example, I'm trying to find a good one. Okay, so I'm going to choose uniformity. That's an example of a word that has something like an emotion tied to it. Let's see if I can find another one. Or love, hate, those are emotive words, mismatches. Adventure, zest, risk. These are all words that bring up kind of emotions with them. That doesn't necessarily mean they have connotations, though. I'm trying to find a specific one that I had earlier. We'll just go with uniformity. So I'm going to pick that word and I'm going to say that I think some kind of emotion is being put forward with this idea of uniformity. And I'm going to ask myself if it has a positive or a negative or a neutral feeling to it. And I would say, think about if you could swap it for something else that would make it sound more neutral or better or worse. So if I thought of a synonym for uniformity in the sense and the context of the sentence here, grading requires uniformity. I could change that to grading requires students to have equal proficiency. That sounds good. Uniformity sounds bad. It sounds rigid, like it's forcing people to lose their individuality, that it's a one size fits all approach. If I say that grading requires equal consideration or something like that, it sounds good. So if you can swap out the word for another word or phrase that would change the way somebody might feel about this situation, if you can swap it out for another synonym, then you've probably figured out an example of connotation. Connotation is when you can see that the author made a particular word choice to support their thinking. We know that Susan Bloom doesn't like grades. So you're going to find in a lot of this article language that sounds negative and that carries negative connotations for the section where she talks about grading. And you're going to find lots of words that are positive and have positive connotations and positive emotions in the section where she talks about her experiment with going gradeless. The way that she speaks is going to support her position. In fact, if ever you're looking for a trick for trying to go through really quickly and figure out how an author feels about a topic, one thing you can do when you're skimming an article is highlight the emotive words and then see how many appear that are positive or negative. And that's going to give you a pretty good indicator of, depending on how opinionated it is, of how the author feels about the topic. Because the connotations are going to come through. So that's going to help you, I think, a little bit in answering that second question here. What connotative language does the author use? Is it positive or negative? Well, sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. Include examples. So that's how you want to kind of approach answering that question. What impact does the connotative language have on the reader? Is it effective? We talked just a little bit about that a moment ago. And then the last question is, what is the overall tone? Is the author using a formal or informal writing style? So when we talk about tone, there is another article that I will link for you. Tone is the way that something is said. It's not what is said, it's the way it's said. And if your mother's ever told you that she didn't want you to use that tone with her, then you understand what I'm talking about. So this learning materials section, this article on tone, explains a little bit more about what tone is, and it also gives examples of tone. So these are different types of tone. There might be positive. These are tone words. Negative tone words. Sorrow, fear, worry, tone words. Neutral tone words. We know in our article that Susan Blum is trying to tell us about an experiment that she's done with going gradeless. So when we think about that, we've got positive and negative. So if you say that she has a cheery tone, that's not going to cover the entire article. If you say that she has a bitter tone, that doesn't really account for her tone at the end when she talks about how great going gradeless has been for her. So when you're looking for a tone word, I would suggest that you try and find one. I wouldn't say she seems too worried or sorrowful or fearful. I would look in this pile of words, the neutral selection of tone words, and see if there's a word in here that explains her tone throughout the article. Overall, how does she sound? Does she sound matter of fact? Does she sound factual? Is it instructive? Is it informative? Since we know it's not wholly positive or negative and she does both, I'm going to suggest that you try and find a word in here that describes her tone. And then a really helpful thing, because I think this is going to help you when you go to write your paragraphs in your actual paper, is when it talks about what is the overall tone, it might not be a bad idea to also come up with a way to describe her tone when she talks about grades. So you could say something like, when she discusses grades, her tone is, and then you could look for one of those negative words. When she discusses grades, look for the one that's the most appropriate. She has a negative take on grades. So do you think that she's testy? Is she belligerent? Is she disgusted? How does she feel when she has the tone when she's talking about grades? And then you could also include a tone word for when she's talking about what it feels like to go gradeless. Is she lighthearted, exuberant, elevated, enthusiastic? I think identifying these three different things, that overall, her overall tone, Blum's overall tone is, pick it from the neutral category. When she discusses grades, her tone is, pick it from the negative category. When she discusses going gradeless, her tone is. That's how I would recommend that you answer this question. So those are just a couple of things to keep in mind as you're working through these three questions. Yes, there's only three, but I do want you to think and look for examples and really reflect on what tone and connotation can do to impact a reader and how they are carried along. Because you may notice that this author is presenting us with information. That's true. But I'm not ready to say yet that it's not a persuasive article. In fact, it is a pretty persuasive article. So what is her language use doing to help persuade? Think about these things as you answer part 3.